Hi again. I hope you're well this week. Now, before we look very quickly at Block's second chapter, let's recap. My thesis for this module is as follows. The Church's communal activity and mission is more complete with persons with disabilities than it is without, as you see on the slide. In order to demonstrate that thesis to some degree, in this video, you'll be examining, and I hope building, on Eastlund's work. You'll do so by using Jennie Weiss Block's multi-layered definition of disability as an indirect connection to questions of the Church as a community. Let's start with context. Jennie Weiss Block, OP, pictured there, is a Dominican Catholic laywoman and a practical theologian who has decades of experience as an accessibility advocate. She was married to one Sandy Block, but he died, thus she's a widow. Her entire book, Copious Hosting, A Theology of Access for People with Disabilities, is a revision of a graduate thesis. As a whole, that text contains numerous profound perspectives on the relations between disability and theology. And in this brief second chapter, Block asks three simple and profound clusters of questions. What is disability and who is disabled? Are we all disabled? And what are we afraid of? Let me show you how Block complements what you've learned about disability so far from Eastlund, starting with her first series of questions. So when she asks what is disability and who is disabled, Block intends to define disability in terms that lay people can understand. So because you didn't get that definition from Eastlund, let me add to it here. According to Block, disability has multiple meanings. You can see three of them on the slide. Feminist scholar of disability, Susan Wendell, defines disability as, quote, socially constructed from a biological reality, end quote. While the Americans with Disabilities Act, the federal legislation that enshrines civil rights for Americans with disabilities, offers a three-part definition. First, disability is a physical or intellectual impairment that limits a person's activities. Second, it's a record of that impairment. And third, it's a social construction where someone is regarded as having that impairment. And Al Condalucci also points out that bridging the gap between an impairment and one's environment, getting in between the person and his or her environment to offer them a helping hand, can remove an impairment. Block also goes back to Wendell's definition to observe that disability is multifactorial. Disability has multiple causes. Second, Block asks, are we all disabled? Here, after some research, the answer is much clearer for Block as for me, no. Not everyone faces social discrimination based on physical, intellectual, and/or emotional capacity. So after touching on Charles Gurney's, Barbara Blodgett's, and Andrew Solomon's answers to her question, Block asserts that both extremes of the problem miss the point. On one hand, saying that everyone is disabled trivializes the conditions of people with disabilities. On the other, saying that no one is disabled diminishes the enormity of the social norms that people with disabilities have to face each day. She further argues, on the slide, people with disabilities cope with particular problems that are not experienced by non-disabled people, and people without disabilities do them an injustice by not recognizing and attempting to understand their uncommon situations, end quote. Eastlund notes basically the same thing elsewhere in her book, especially when she writes about the inaccessibility of the communion rite. Remember, she says that because of our acute physical and intellectual needs, people with disabilities demand understanding and a struggle for access, rather than uncomfortable laughter and ignorance and blank looks. Now, while Block attempts to argue, immediately after the assertion about our particular problems, that people with and without disabilities can, quote, share solidarity in the sharing of the human condition from which no one is exempt. I'm not certain it's quite that simple. Yes, we are all human, there is a level of solidarity there, but people with disabilities expand the definition of humanity so that we can see all of God's intention. In her book, Eastland also complements the idea of resistance as expansion. When she writes about resistance in Disabled God, you might remember, Eastland asserts that people with disabilities place our bodies on the line in order to declare our positions on issues that matter to us. So by resisting with our bodies, people with disabilities exercise our human capacities and so expand the definition of humanity. Third of Block's questions. Block asks, what are we afraid of? By we, Block means people of able body. She suggests that pain, suffering, and death are the content of the fear that people of able body feel in the presence of disability. And she says it like this, as you see on the slide. We struggle to make sense of disability. The suffering that we see scares us. The fear of becoming disabled makes us uncomfortable. People with disabilities assault our cultural norms. We search for security in our values of attractiveness, independence, self-sufficiency, and productivity. We are startled by the thought that God might not care if we are attractive, independent, and productive, and so we keep our distance. Everything that Block says in that paragraph is true to some degree, and so it doesn't require a ton of elaboration. Disability makes people of able body and people with disabilities alike uncomfortable. We do all aspire to ideals of independence, self-sufficiency, and productivity that aren't really attainable, and the discomfort that disability causes can allow people of different abilities to keep our distance from each other. That's pretty straightforward. But this is why a short explanatory chapter on disability matters to an exploration of ecclesiology. The Church's communal activity and mission is more complete with people with disabilities than without. We who have disabilities matter both because we are neighbors to those without and because we disclose God's grace in all its revelatory power through our vulnerability and our capacity. We are your neighbors insofar as everyone I'm talking to on this video knows someone who has a disability or a chronic illness. We are a part of your life. And we disclose God's grace because we both require and extend hospitality to others in our relative weakness, our bodily ambiguity, and our unconventional modes of perception. And that is where Block's last quotation comes into play. In light of disabilities throwing into confusion the ideals of perfection and self-control, Block claims, and I quote, "Disability brings the eschatological horizon into sharp focus," end quote. Like I said above, people with disabilities extend the definition of humanity. Plus, because of our openness to God's power in our limitations, people with disabilities can testify to the extension of God's kingdom as well. In the presence of disability, the kingdom of God comes near. That's a good place to stop and recap. In this short video, you've done 4 small but very significant things with my guidance. First, you've used Block's work in creative tension with Eastland's in order to broaden your definitions of disability. Second, you have examined a critical assumption made by many people of able body, that human beings are all disabled, and critiqued it pretty stringently because people with disabilities face problems that most people do not, in terms of functional limitation and social status. Third, you've asked with Block what people of able body are afraid of, and established that the discomfort they feel in the presence of disability emerges from the nearness of pain, suffering, and death. Fourth, and furthermore, you've discerned why these matters are integral to ecclesiology and Christian ministry. That's probably a good place to pause before we go on to the next video. When you're ready, please go on to Frisk. Thank you.